From the seventh shelf of the lower archive, in a worm-bitten copy attributed to Magus Hagbard, who wrote in his old age and claimed to have heard this account from one of the last keepers of the chain. If thou hast patience, read on. If thou seekest only dates and names, then ask a scribe and not an old wizard, for this matter is not well carried by bare facts. In the old world of Sonira, at a time when Edrin's learned houses still held themselves as the proper stewards of all serious magic, there stood on the island's edge an abandoned structure, half broken by weather and salt, and so neglected that even thieves found little use in it. The place had once been built for study, or so men believed, but by the time this tale begins, its upper chambers were open to rain. The stone stairs had split, and the inner halls smelled of damp mortar and old seabirds. Most passed it by without a second look. Such places are often dismissed by the proud, though they are sometimes the very places from which troublesome ideas begin. It was there that the three founders first gathered, not because the ruin was noble, but because it was available to them, and because no lord or rector cared enough to stop them while the thing still looked like failure. Angel Storm came first, if the older accounts are to be believed. He was already known in some circles for his unusual manner of working against hostile sorcery. He trusted little in ornament, and less in ceremony. Where most anti-curse practitioners preferred careful unraveling, he had a talent for finding the stress point in malicious workings, and to break it with decisive force. Because of this, he carried, even in scholarly company, a heavy club wrapped against weather and travel. Students later embellished this into legend, as students tend to do, but every telling agrees on one point. He was not a courtly mage, and those who mocked him stopped when they saw him work. Morelia, the elven founder, is described in every surviving account with greater affection than precision, which is often how memory preserves the best among us. The records say she handled mana with exceptional restraint and clarity, and that she could steady inexperienced casters before they harmed themselves or others. This may sound like a small virtue to those who have never taught, but I say plainly, such a gift is rarer than brilliance. Many can cast, fewer can guide. The Arcanum owed much of its early survival to those who entered in fear, and remained because someone in those halls made learning feel possible. Filthy Grin arrived later than the other two, coming out of Thias with more practical experience than formal standing. I have seen later copies attempt to make him either comic or crude, which I judge unfair. The oldest notes portray a man who understood streets, smugglers, debts, routes, and the kinds of danger that do not announce themselves in magical terminology. He knew how supplies moved, how information leaked, and how institutions pressured those who lacked patronage. In a gentler age, he might have been remembered as an administrator. In the age he lived in, he was the sort of man without whom many noble projects die in their first winter. These three were unlike one another in habit and training, but they shared a singular conviction that proved offensive to the learned authorities of Edrin, namely, that magical instruction should not be restricted so tightly by birth, sponsorship, and institutional favor. They did not begin with manifestos, however, as some later retellings claim. They began with something much humbler: repairs. A roof patched badly is still better than rain on manuscripts. A table dragged into place is still a table. A chalk circle on rough stone can teach as surely as one laid in polished marble, provided the master knows what he is doing. And so the ruin became a school by degrees, then by reputation, and at last by undeniable fact. Students came in numbers that surprised even the founders. Some came with prior training that had been turned down elsewhere, or with only fragments of knowledge trumped by a dangerous degree of confidence. Others came with almost nothing, except curiosity and a heartfelt desire to learn that which had long been denied them. The founders taught according to need. Angel Storm trained them in recognizing and breaking harmful workings. Morelia taught discipline, control, and the handling of mana without waste or vanity. Filthy Grin taught what every sanctuary must know if it is to endure, including how to keep stores, how to move quietly when watched, and how not to mistake idealism for protection. In those years, the students formed the fellowship later known as the Chain. The name's first appearance was merely a note in the margin of a scroll, then in practice rosters, then in seals. It seems to have been chosen to express a mutual dependence or loyalty between peers rather than rank. That is a fine sentiment in any age, though it tends to irk those whose authority depends on hierarchical order. As the Arcanum grew, so too did concern in the established schools. I do not say this concern wasn't substantiated. No. Any place that teaches power outside recognized structures will attract both promise and folly, and the Arcanum had its share of both. There were accidents, disputes. There were, by some accounts, apprentices attempting workings well beyond their capability. But the anger towards the founders was not proportionate to these failings, for the same could be said of any academy in Edron, if one were minded to inspect fairly. What made the Arcanum intolerable was not that it erred, but that it succeeded while renouncing ancient gatekeeping ideals. They were branded apostates. What happened afterward is difficult to reconstruct in accurate details, because the surviving testimonies were written by those who fled, hid, or remembered only in fragments. Yet the broad strokes are clear. A suppression working, large in scale and subtle in design, was cast against the Arcanum at night. Its purpose was not simple destruction. It interfered with the capacity to hold and direct mana within the affected grounds. Spells failed mid-formation. Wards weakened. Skilled casters found their control slipping in ways they could recognize but not quickly remedy. This was the act of learned enemies, and of enemies willing to cripple a school full of novices so long as the lesson reached the right eyes. The founders understood sooner than the students that their home could not be held for long. Several accounts corroborate that they gathered the novices and ordered them into the inner dormitories and shielded chambers, where what protections remained could be concentrated. Some students wished to fight. It is difficult not to commend their bravery, and harder still to judge the founders who commanded them to stand down, while despair spread through the hall. Morelia is said to have moved among them, soothing where she could. Angel Storm and Filthy Grin prepared the outer defenses, though by then both knew defense in any ordinary sense were doomed to fail. At this point, the chronicles pass from likely fact into the territory of high magic, but enough sources align that I accept the essential claim. The founders chose not to abandon the Arcanum piecemeal, nor to let it fall intact into hostile hands. They attempted a relocation of the entire foundation, structure, wards, archives, and such persons as could be held within its protected core. By any sober measure, this should have killed them before completion. In truth, it did kill them, though not before the work was done. Angel Storm is said to have broken a portion of the suppressive lattice by force, creating a brief instability that allowed for the larger spell to take hold. Morelia held the mana stream through conditions no living caster should have been able to sustain. Filthy Grin selected the receiving site and laid the practical preparations years in advance, without perhaps even knowing fully what future use they would serve. Here one sees his genius most clearly. Great magical feats are often praised at the moment of casting, but they usually depend upon some earlier mind that prepared roads, caches, routes, and contingencies while everyone else was speaking of glory. The destination was the world of Antica, deep beneath Theiss, in the hidden underways later associated with smugglers and forgotten chambers. Why there, one may ask, and why not some remote sanctum? Because secrecy is not always best kept in wilderness. It is often best kept under the feet of busy men who think only of markets, taverns, and the next day's coin. A hidden thing near the center of everyday life may endure longer than a hidden thing placed where seekers go expressly to seek. The translocation spell damaged the Arcanum badly, however. This too is consistent across all descriptions. Internal spaces were twisted, stairs led strangely, doors no longer answered the architecture from which they came. Parts of the foundation appear to have shifted out of sensible alignment, as if the place remembered its former shape but could not perfectly reconstruct it. Yet enough survived. The chain survived in remnants. Some archives survived. Certain wards endured, though weakened, and these seem to have sealed the deeper sections for generations. Time then did what time always does. Witnesses move on, forgot and passed away. Students became masters, legends, then myth. Stories retold so often that they were indistinguishable. The chain persisted in scraps of symbol and oath among scattered inheritors, but the Arcanum itself passed out of common knowledge. I suspect this forgetting was not entirely accidental. People who survive persecution often teach their children caution before history. As for the Arcanum's rediscovery, I shall write only what appears in the most repeated account. A seeker moving through the lower passages beneath Thais followed an unusual webbing that did not burn as ordinary silk burns. This led to an old sealed threshold marked with the sign of the chain. Whether the words spoken there were exact or merely close enough, I cannot say. Old wards are sometimes like old men, in that they do not require perfection, only respect and a voice that remembers. The seals answered. The halls, long silent, stirred again, and thus the Arcanum, which had been thought destroyed in Sonera, forgotten beneath the years, returned to the knowledge of the living. Let this be copied faithfully. The tale has suffered enough from embellishment.